Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. Nice to see everyone. It's quite a full room. Okay. So firstly, I wanted to thank the SRA for the invitation to come and speak to you today. I'm particularly grateful to Tina and the other organisers and my fellow speakers who were very generous and agreed to change the timing around so that I could travel down this morning. And so I'm very grateful, and my little cat Lilo is also very grateful not to be left on her own overnight. So I know the conversation this morning has been on the changing landscape of research, with a focus on new technologies and the opportunities and challenges that they bring for all of us as social researchers. And I believe that Jeff has spoken on the changing role of social science research, in particular whether the role of social science research is to understand the world or change it. And this perhaps speaks to our understanding of what social science is for, who it's for, and more importantly, who gets to decide this. Certainly within the academy, the focus on impact is increasingly driven by government funding agendas and a quite narrow idea of what and who counts and what's useful. And I've done that kind of work myself at times, so I have no objection to that kind of work. Surely as social researchers, we want our work to change the world. Otherwise, as Stuart Hall once asked, what is the point? But I guess one of the main points I would want to make as well is that we need to allow space in social research for things that are less tangible: imagination, surprise, humour, anger, empathy, love, humanity. And for me, this is where ethnography is really important. So perhaps I'm providing a counterpoint to what you've been discussing this morning, and I'm going to focus on what I think of as a quite kind of old-fashioned, quite low-tech approach to research, which is ethnography. And I'm not talking about some of its kind of, trendier reincarnations, such as digital ethnography or multi-species ethnography, which is a thing I just recently discovered, or its more expanded view, which sees all qualitative research as being ethnography, or that believes that if you've had a cup of coffee with somebody after you've done their interview, that counts as ethnography. I'm not talking about that. What I want to do is make a claim for a more traditional idea of the ethnographer in the field over a long period of time, learning about their chosen tribe and people, in inverted commas, notebook or digital recorder maybe in hand, and then telling those stories to others. Ethnography, after all, means writing about people, and those two elements, people and writing, I think point to a unique combination of a kind of humanistic approach to research and the importance of storytelling. Now, there are lots of issues with ethnography, particularly with the kind of approach which has its roots in kind of colonial anthropology, very rooted in kind of British colonial power, but also in sociological ethnography, which has its own version of kind of tribes and exotic others. But there are also unique strengths. Howard Becker famously wrote, "The purpose of social research is to," quote, "make the strange familiar and the familiar strange." And I think ethnography is really well positioned to do that. And that's what it should be doing. So my own research over the past, and you're very polite to kind of slightly fudge the issue of time, but over 35 years has been on race, ethnicity, and identity. So with a particular focus on youth and masculinity, which is what the Asian gang work's been about. More recently on South Asian migration and Muslim identities. My PhD is in anthropology, so kind of inevitably I did ethnographic research, because that's what anthropologists do. But my undergraduate degree was in English literature, so I think I was drawn to ethnography because of the possibilities of storytelling, so its links to ideas of character, plot, and voice that ethnography offers. But I also wanted to lift it off the page to do something that was kind of real life. So my PhD research was on Black British youth identities, and like most academics, I think, these issues have a very personal spark. So for me, it was largely because I was adopted as a baby by a white English family, and I grew up in the Cotswolds. My family were white. I was the only person of colour in my village. God, that sounds like a bad kind of Little Britain joke, but it's not. The only non-white person in my school. I met my first black person when I was 17, if you can believe that, and my first Asian person when I was 19 and went to university. So I grew up a lot wondering about, who I was and where I fitted and how to make sense of my difference from the people around me. And I was also really aware of how people saw me and how they had expectations of me that really didn't fit with who I thought I was. So I would get the usual kind of, where are you from? No, but really, where are you from? Usually followed by, well, your English is really very good. And then, so are you having an arranged marriage? So I grew up at the same, through the 70s and early 80s, when a generation of Black and Asian young people in Britain were struggling with the same questions, if very different circumstances. And I was watching the news, watching the kind of, the protests and the riots in London in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, and thinking about how my experience linked to that or didn't, and wanting to explore those links. So I became very interested in the question of stereotyping and how that stereotyping shapes the kind of lives and experiences of Black and Asian young people in Britain. But I also wanted to move beyond that to try and understand their lives and experiences in their own terms, rather than kind of being constantly spoken for or spoken about, which I think is still a problem. So I began my PhD research in 1989, and many of you are probably too young for this, but there was an article in The Face at the time, Face magazine, on Jazzy B and Soul to Soul, and they called Jazzy B the new funky face of Black Britain. And it was really the first time at that period that people started to think about Black youth identities as something creative and positive and possible, because up until that point there was a lot of kind of very negative stereotyping. So that was what I wanted to explore. So I did my field work. I worked for a year in London, shared a flat with a guy called Richard. And actually, I supervise a lot of PhD students now, and I would never let them do I did a lot of really just kind of, it was chaos. I don't know what I was doing, honestly. So I spent a bit of time in a community centre in West London. I spent a bit of time with a woman and her brothers in northwest London, and actually the woman is still a very good friend of mine, and I'm now godmother to her daughter. But mainly I kind of just hung around with this guy that I was sharing a flat with and just went out with him and kind of hung around. But one of the things that I learned very early is that ethnography very quickly shatters any illusions you have about going into the field, however you think of that. Very naively, and I mean I was 28 or something, 25 maybe. I expected to discover a whole new world, which would be completely opposite to the negative stereotypes, and my research would overturn those stereotypes, and it would be great. All the bad stuff would be out, and all the good stuff would be in. And what I found, of course, fairly obviously, is that the picture's a lot more complicated than that. My participants didn't live in some separate autonomous bubble apart from the world. They were entangled with it. They couldn't avoid those stereotypes. They lived every day with them. They surrounded them. They had to negotiate them. But at the same time, and most importantly, they did not define them, not completely. There was a place for agency, for contestation, for what Stuart Hall would call play. So one of them I was asking one of them once about the myth of Black sexuality, and he said to me, oh, you mean the legend of Black sexuality? So there's a kind of, there's a space for a little bit of kind of humour and imagination, and that led to the title of the book being called The Art of Being Black, which I got into a certain amount of trouble for. But anyway, it was that idea of kind of space to create. So from there I went on to do work on Asian youth identities, and that largely came out of a challenge from my former PhD student, supervisor, who said to me, Claire, Asian youth cannot be as boring as research makes it sound. So there was a lot of work at that time. It was always around arranged marriages, around religion. I used to think of it as the kind of Whiskers cat food approach to research, which was always, 8 out of 10 Asian girls think they're going to have an arranged marriage, and it never really kind of got beyond that. So I started doing some work on Asian youth, which was to become my passion for the next 30 years of my life and counting. And the first proper fieldwork took place in the mid-90s in London, not East London. Everyone always assumes it's East London, but it actually wasn't. It was not East London. And I worked for 5 years in a youth project for Asian young men. All but one of them were Bangladeshi Muslim young men. When I met them first, they were aged between 13 and 16. And a couple of points to make. Firstly, that the nature of the fieldwork and my relationship with the participants between that project and my first PhD project was really different. The participants were younger. I was a bit older by then. I was in my early 30s. We had, nothing in common that I could kind of think of. But the changing dynamics of those relationships are really important when you think about doing ethnography. I was the same person, but actually those relationships between those two projects were completely opposed in many ways. The second point was one of a kind of surprising continuity with the first project. So these young men were struggling with the same issues of negative representation and stereotyping. Being younger, the mechanisms of control, so school, police, mosque even, community, parents, were much, much more apparent and more constraining. And although I didn't plan it this way, and I sometimes feel like my career looks like I've been chasing ambulances, but actually around the time, purely coincidentally, there was a big moral panic, particularly in London actually, around Asian gangs. And actually rehearsed a lot of the same stereotypes that people were using about black youth in the kind of 70s and 80s. So ideas of identity crisis, generational crisis, gendered pathology, criminality, and threat, that all those things were kind of being recycled towards this new group. And we can still see the threads of that moral panic in contemporary concerns around extremism and grooming gangs, the ideas of cultural backwardness, separate kind of parallel lives, gendered pathologies, and so on. So one of the joys, I think, and privileges of ethnography is the relationships that can develop over the course of field work. It's very different from what I think of as kind of hit and run research. Leaving the field, writing up as the subject of a lot of kind of angst amongst ethnographers. But if you're working at home, and whether we think of home as being kind of, geography or community, that separation doesn't always happen. And nor is it really desirable. So with the Asian gang participants, this never happened. I worked with them all the time that I was writing the book. They read the chapters, some of them, they commented on them. And over the years, I was able to follow them after the project finished. And it was from that longer, unofficial relationship that the second book happened. So I think of it really as a bit of an accidental ethnography, where you find yourself in the research before you actually start to think of it as research. And it actually came out of a discussion at a wedding, one of the participants' weddings, where they were kind of like, oh, what happened with the book? And I was looking at them thinking, God, it's so interesting to just see what they've done and where they've ended up, 15 years later, whatever. So I followed it up with a short period of interviews in 2012. So they were then in their kind of mid to late 30s. But also kind of, because it took me a decade to write it up, I also followed them through the 10 years that I was writing it up, and that's also woven through the narrative. So it's a very different kind of ethnography. One could argue that it's not really ethnography at all, because the field has kind of extended over time, over space. It took place, things were happening even when we weren't actually in the same space. It was very uneven, it was quite fractured. So I referred to this as salvage ethnography. So it's made up of fragments, memories, formal and informal knowledge, gossip, speculation. So writing the ethnography in this context was really difficult and a little bit treacherous. I wasn't quite sure what I was supposed to know and not supposed to know, and what I could say or not say. So it took me a decade to write it, which was, I was telling someone earlier that one of the boys is now no longer speaking to me. So 5 quick things to say about ethnography. Firstly, that it takes time. It's not a form of quick and dirty research. So my first project took a year. I would say that's probably a minimum for ethnography, often much longer. The Asian Gang, 5 years. With the Asian Gang Revisited, I'm up to 35 years and counting. I often joke that my next book will be The Asian Gang Gets a Free Bus Pass. So, fieldwork takes time, it takes patience, resilience, a huge amount of luck, actually. I think people often dismiss ethnography as being very easy, that you kind of turn up and you hang around. Or they think it's really exciting and glamorous, and you're kind of doing a bit of undercover journalism, and you're going to, Neither of these views are right. It involves often a lot of standing around, feeling and almost certainly looking quite stupid, really not knowing what's going on, wondering if anybody will ever actually speak to you. When I started the Asian Gang project, I would ring my friends and say, no, my 6 months, nobody speaks to me, they all hate me. It's often boring, it's often frustrating, it's sometimes dangerous, sometimes it's just bizarre. A couple of times I was mistaken for a prostitute in my first project. In the second project, I was mistaken several times for the mother of these 16-year-old boys, 8 16-year-old boys. Oh, are you their mother? Yes, I'm the mother of all of them. In the space of 2 years, I went from kind of, prostitute to mother. A couple of times I've been threatened with violence. Once I had my car window smashed. So I guess it's safe to say that ethnography isn't the kind of research that funders and government really pay for, but they should. Secondly, ethnography is about power, but not always in the way that you think. It's often complex and contradictory, so ethnography is inductive rather than deductive. You need to take time to see what emerges rather than going in with a set of questions or focuses. Fieldwork is a pretty surefire way of exploding any preconceptions that you might have when you enter the field. It relies on the experience of others to set the agenda. That means ceding control, which is not always a comfortable place to be. It's about the establishment of relationships that are mutual and that you don't actually have that much control over. They're not always what you imagine. So while I was crying to my friends about nobody speaking to me, it turns out the young man I was working with had already had a set of kind of ideas and relationships in their head about where I fitted into their life. And those relationships change over time. Of course, at the same time, the ethnographer is in a position of power in terms of what they choose to focus on and in terms of the external structures. Often ethnography traditionally studies down and in, so kind of small groups and often marginalized groups, and that can be problematic, although it has changed in recent years. And of course, we have control over how we want to write the story, ultimately. I mean, there have been some attempts to try and kind of co-write and all that kind of thing in ethnography, but it's still basically up to the person who's writing. The third point is that it's partial. So one of the key strengths of ethnography, or one of its weaknesses, depending on your perspective, is that it's very reflexive. It insists that knowledge is situated. So traditionally, ethnography would have made its claims to kind of objective truth on the being there. I was there, I saw it. But that claim largely fell away, certainly from the 1970s onwards, to be replaced with a focus on reflexivity. So what are the nature of the relationships that you're working with, but also the positionality of the researcher themselves and what they bring to the field. So in saying ethnography is partial, I mean it in the sense of being, only part of an overall picture, because you can't see and know everything, but also because it's inflected through your own experiences, biases, feelings, and so on. So Clifford and Marcus refer to ethnography as fiction, to acknowledge this constructed nature. So of course all knowledge is partial and constructed, but ethnography perhaps the most self-consciously so. And at its extreme, you get ethnographers that just write about themselves, and I'm not a big fan of that, because I think, ultimately, ethnography should not be about you. Now, for those of you in the audience that are more inclined towards objectivism in research, this probably raises questions of replicability. And my view would be that ethnography is never replicable because of those dynamics, those very personal dynamics in the field. But that doesn't mean that it can't be resonant and truthful. So I read somewhere ages ago that the sign of a good ethnography is that if you show it to the people that you've written it about, they'll look at it and go, yeah, and? So that's kind of what I was aiming for. And Seamus Khan recently wrote in a review of the Asian Gang Revisited that, quote, ethnographic practice might not get us to truth, but it may achieve understanding. So fourthly, then, very quickly, ethnography is about context, where and when you do the work, in terms of the interpersonal relationships in the field, with all of the blind spots that come with that, but also in terms of the social field in which it's located. So people often dismiss ethnography because it's very small scale. So what's very important is that not only looking down and in, but you have to look up and out and look at the context in which those relationships and those groups are situated and understood. Otherwise, Harry Goulbourne once referred to this as kind of zoological. You're going and you're kind of peering in the cage at whatever kind of group you're looking at. And many ethnographies of race have been criticised in the UK for precisely having done that. As I discovered when I did The Art of Being Black, when I realised that nobody had done an ethnography of race for, 20 years because they were all terrible and nobody wanted to take part. So my participants didn't live their lives separate from the power inequities and stereotypes that constrained them. These were things that impacted their everyday lives, but as I said earlier, they weren't defined by those. And lastly, just to say that the power of ethnography for me is it renders the lives of people who are most usually invisible or are spoken about or of visible, and it represents them in all their complexity and humanity. So I think of this as lives in 3D. And for racialized groups in particular, it's about making the other recognizable, opening up ways of being and knowing without falling prey to easy narratives of heroism or villainy or authenticity. It recognizes that families and communities are complex with agency as well as constraint. They change over time. So it opens up a space for understanding and empathy. And with the Asian Gang Revisited, this is my last point, I I tried to explore a fourth dimension, which was change over time. So following the lives of those participants over 25 years as they grew from teenagers through to their mid-40s, they forged their own paths in education and work and love, had children, provides a challenge to studies, particularly, including my own first study actually, which picks them at a particular moment in time and fixes them. And often when people talk about racialized communities, and particularly young people, they kind of set them in aspect as if they never grow out of that. They're always kind of there, they're always in that kind of moment, caught forever. But of course, people change, the world changes too. The young men I worked with grew to adulthood against the backdrop of the war on terror, the 7/7 bombings, the spread of dinner party Islamophobia, austerity and Brexit. All of those things impacted them as they grew into adulthood. So what was interesting for me was watching this group of participants who were a quite tight-knit group when they were kind of in their teens, came from the same school and estate, as they grew up and kind of went their own ways in very, very different kind of paths from each other, but also from what they thought they would be doing when they were 16. But all equally important, I think my favourite thing about it was the fact that they were all still in contact with each other, that those ties of friendship and loyalty and care kept them in contact across those 25 years, and so looking at what the dynamics of those friendships were. So being part of that journey and bearing witness to that is, for me, where the power and the joy of ethnography lies. Thank you.